Jessica Meyer. I'm a research fellow here in the School of History. I think everybody does know me at this stage. Welcome to this, the last session of the Legacies of War seminar for this semester, where it gives me huge pleasure to introduce Heather Ellis, who I'm not going to embarrass by reading out large chunks of her biography from Sheffield's website.
Just read the title and I'll get on with it.
Heather is a member of the Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Sheffield, now having recently moved from Liverpool Hope, where her main field of research is the history of education and particularly the history of universities. Her first monograph, Generational Conflict and University Reform, Oxford in the Age of Revolutions, which was published by Brill in 2012, won the Kevin Mahoney Prize for Best First Book in the History of Education. And she's currently completing her second monograph on masculinity and science in Britain, 1831 to 1918, of which I gather we're going to hear the last bit, in The Sage and the Hero, British Science, Masculinity and the First World War.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me as well. It's an honour to be the final speaker in the series. Just to ask at the beginning, does anyone know the British Association for the Advancement of Science, or does anyone not know it? Hands up if you don't know it. Okay, as I'm going to be talking quite a lot about it, so I thought I'd perhaps tell you what it is first. It was founded in 1831, and it was basically the brainchild of a group of gentlemen scientists who are keen to promote the public recognition of science and public status of the natural sciences, as opposed to the classics and the traditional subjects studied at university. And it's still in existence today as the British Science Association, if any of you, which still has the public work of science as its main focus. So if you hear me talk about the BAAS or the BA, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, and that's what the book is about. So that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so my little figures up here don't have much to do with what I'm talking about. I just think they're really cute. And it's sort of, who are the sort of heroes of science? And actually there is a woman up there. There is Marie Curie, who's possibly the one that most people know. Anyway, okay. On the eve of the First World War, the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and you all know what that is now, was facing something of an identity crisis. From its origins back in the early 1830s, it had worked hard to raise the profile of the scientist among the public, much of which had revolved around tackling long-standing assumptions about the reclusive, effete, and sometimes, quite frankly, unmanly work which scientists undertook in cloistered universities or isolated private houses. A particular brand of scientific masculinity had been cultivated based on a notion of professional independence, freedom from state interference, and embodied above all in an ideal of scientific internationalism. In recent decades, however, this internationalist stance had been challenged through a growing tendency to identify the interests of the British Association not so much directly with those of the state as with those of the Empire. From 1882, following a particularly difficult few years of public criticism revolving around the purpose of the British Association, the body held the first of several overseas meetings, which were in reality all held in the British Dominions, in Montreal, Toronto, South Africa, and in 1914, Australia. I'll just show you a little bit. I call them the imperial meetings, but they're actually called overseas, which slightly confuses the issue. The activities of the association in an age of popular imperialism began to assume a distinctly imperialist tone, and therefore on the eve of the First World War, members of the association found their loyalties split between the old internationalist ethos and the more recent focus on imperial unity, which sat rather awkwardly alongside it, and more worryingly raised the possibility that scientists could be seen as potentially disloyal to king and country. Indeed, the context in which many members of the British Association learned of the outbreak of the First World War captures this paradox quite nicely. Does anyone know where they were in 1914 when war broke out? They were. It's similar, but they weren't. They were on their way to Australia in a boat full of Germans, which was an interesting place to be. So a large delegation of about 150 British Association members were en route by ship to Australia for the 1914 annual meeting of the British Association, which was one of these imperial meetings. On the one hand, the meeting was clearly designed to foster imperial unity. Sir Charles Lucas, former Undersecretary for the Colonies, had pioneered the meeting, following on from the success of the 1905 meeting in South Africa. And you can guess what that was designed to help make up for and to appease. There's an issue of scientific or cultural diplomacy in these meetings. They tend to go to areas of the British Empire where there has recently been a war or a conflict. And the visit to Australia was co-sponsored by the Victoria branch of the Imperial Federation League, and the Prime Minister of Australia declared that the Australian government and those of the states are impressed with the importance of this event, not just for the causes of science, but also for imperial unity. So this sort of discourse was very much in the background. On the other hand, the party travelling from Britain was a distinctly international one, with a considerable number of German members on board. Germans had been one of the largest groups of so-called foreign members since the foundation of the association in 1831. Indeed, distinguished German scientists were explicitly requested by the Australian organisers to lend éclat and manliness, interestingly, to the meeting. And this is in the personal correspondence of the organisers with Charles Lucas. Professors Albrecht Penck from Berlin, the geographer and a geologist, and Johannes Walter, the famous desert geologist from Halle, were requested by name because of their individual reputations. And many of these foreign guests were close friends of the English colleagues they travelled with. So in the first days after war had been declared, to show you some of the members of the German delegation at the 1914 meeting, picture there. In the first days after war had been declared, despite the quick establishment of a patriotic fund, and there's a poster there which was designed to raise money for that fund, which was launched at the meeting, many German delegates encountered huge problems accessing their funds, as banks in Australia refused to receive money from German banks. And the British Association Treasurer, Professor John Perry, intervened personally on behalf of nearly all of the German delegates, offering his own funds to meet their expenses. For example, on the 24th of August 1914, he had to give a personal guarantee to the Commonwealth Bank of Australia in the event that the Dresdner Bank would not release the money of a Professor Goldstein of Berlin, and in the event they didn't release the money. And it's just interesting to quote Professor Perry's letter to the British Treasury, arguing why his giving of funds to this German professor ought not to come under the Trading with the Enemy Act, which it was supposed to do. And he says, "Great difficulty was experienced by some of our foreign members on their arrival in Australia in view of the stoppage of funds. I have been compelled to pay under the guarantee I so gave, and I venture to suggest that the transaction is hardly one that was intended to be vetoed under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and that it should be recognised that the association, written as ASS, which is quite funny, was almost in honour bound to do their best to see that their foreign members were not left helpless in an English colony to which they had proceeded at the invitation of the association." So there is a sense of, a sort of shared sense of scientific identity, of brotherhood, and also of honour, which continues despite the situation of war. In some cases, the help provided went much further than this. Albrecht Penck, although he was able to return to Britain, couldn't for several weeks, for diplomatic reasons and financial reasons, actually secure safe passage back to his home in Berlin. So the Council of the British Association invited him to basically lodge in their headquarters at Burlington House, and he stayed there for the duration of the war, finding it much nicer than going back to Berlin. And it said just as long as it might take to resolve his predicament, it took substantially longer than perhaps it actually needed to do. So at the same time in Australia, it was a German-born scientist, Arthur Schuster, who was also a naturalised British citizen, who was elected as the new president. So also after war had been declared, they elected a German president, just to make the point. The formal election took place after a declaration of war had been made known, and it's important to note that against this background, the continued focus on internationalism did not go down especially well in certain portions of the British press, as you might imagine, particularly after the declaration of the professors in Germany, which is quite well known. So one article covering the election of Schuster gives a valuable insight into some of the reactions among the British public. There are many I could pick, but this one is quite insightful. It appeared in the English Review in October of 1914, so it's right at the start of this process, and it claimed that, quote, "Hitherto the British Association has been a British institution in constitution and conduct, and it is strange that it should cease to be so and fall under alien control in this year of all years, the 85th of its existence, when we are at war with Germany." The author complained that the British Association's General Committee thoughtlessly accepted Schuster's nomination in Australia, and that not a few have raised no public objection to his appearance in this office. In justification, he continued, "We have had the usual talk of science being international," and this is just days after the declaration of war. In effect, he concluded, "Our scientific men have proved themselves cowards, as they always were, and have asked us to turn the other cheek to the enemy." By the early years of the 20th century, as I mentioned at the start, the British Association had rather lost its way. Ridiculed by some for being little more than a society organising lavish and expensive social activities for scientists, and to be fair, it was ridiculed for that in the 1830s as well, so it was something that it never quite got rid of. Its golden years in the early to mid-19th century, when major scientific discoveries were announced at its meetings, was widely seen to be long over. However, despite the long-standing internationalism of the organisation, many leading figures within the British Association viewed the First World War as a welcome opportunity to prove their usefulness to both nation and empire and to vindicate the collective masculinity of men of science. And this is mostly taken from personal correspondence, which isn't published, because that isn't a position that would have been particularly welcomed at the time. There's open discussion within closed meetings, if that makes sense, of the First World War as an opportunity to be exploited. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. As the mechanical engineer Henry Healy-Shaw wrote to the British Association President Arthur Schuster on the 19th of August 1915, the British Association, quote, "does not form, as once it did, the recognised channel of communicating new discoveries and inventions to the world, and it is now generally regarded merely as an effete body, holding annual meetings in this country and the colonies, at which scientific men can attend with their women social gatherings." Again, it's interesting wording. He went on to argue that the war had the potential to give what he described as a fresh lease of life and energy to the association. This was all about raising the public profile of the BA and of the scientist himself as an active, dynamic national hero. What he recommended, therefore, also had a distinctly imperial twist. We must lead the way, he insisted, on, quote, "applying the resources of science directly to handling many of the great problems of the British Empire. And what is needed is the formation of a strong, manly committee." Again, you have this coupling of the language of manliness with applying the talents of science to solving and tackling concrete problems. So this language of action coupled with manliness. As soon as possible, it is essential to ensure that the first step is taken towards a work which the truly imperial character of the British Association so eminently justifies and indeed demands that it should undertake. So again, you have this language of empire which has never been so strong in the private correspondence of its leading members. So here it is the British Association and science's imperial character which is stressed over its international dimension. At a more solidly institutional level, the organising committee of the Association's Educational Science section released a memorandum in June of 1916 pushing for a sustained campaign for the popularisation of science through public lectures. Echoing the concerns of Healy-Shaw, the Educational Science section lamented the dwindling public interest in science in recent years, complaining that it was far less manifest than a generation ago. And then the side note to that is that our children are far less intelligent than a generation ago, which is slightly unfair, I think. Emphasising one of the original objects of the British Association, namely to spread knowledge about science to the wider public, the memorandum urged that, quote, "much more remains to be done if advantage is to be taken of the exceptional opportunity which the war has given," and this is in 1916, so the outcome is far from known, "of showing that scientific method and thought and scientific men are essential factors of modern progress." and that they are actually thinking in terms of these categories, I find quite interesting. This went not only for scientific method, as I've said, but also for the man of science. The public at large, the memorandum concluded, has considered the scientist as something of an effete and esoteric character, and the war now offers an invaluable opportunity to prove his manhood at a time of national crisis. I mean, it's quite explicit, this language. It's not as though you almost have to read it into the words. Quite often the terms are quite explicit. Much of this drive focused on proposals for maximising the natural resources of the different parts of the British Empire and trying to mobilise them in the war against Germany. Such activities arguably provide a good example of what Gillian Rose has termed scientific masculinity, or the subordination of a figuratively female nature to masculine human will. In 1915, the British Association established a special Committee of Problems after the war. I love the optimism about this. In 1915, to set up a committee of problems after the war, assuming a victory. No doubt expressed at all in the correspondence about the setting up of this committee. They simply wanted to be prepared because they thought it would be over very quickly, which I think we've all heard about. All the sections of the British Association, and I should say the sections represent the individual sciences which make up the overall body. So you'd have a physiology section, a geography section, and so on. And they were asked to address problems arising from the future effects of the war upon national and imperial welfare. And when asked, the geographical section showed significant interest in surveying with a view to harnessing the geological, agricultural, economic and human resources of empire for the war effort, and they also looked forward to reorganising the empire more efficiently after the war when they'd taken over all of Germany's former colonies. And they write about this in absolute certainty that it's going to happen. And here they may be fairly described as seeking to act as the scientific arm of empire. That's actually a term that they use in their committee notes. The anthropological section likewise expressed an interest in acquiring Germany's ethnographic maps of its former colonies, and they're described as its former colonies, with a view to possible territorial settlements after the war. The mathematics and physics section, replying in January 1915, urged sectional cooperation, in particular with geography, to collect what it described as meteorological and geographical data to support British military operations, especially in innovative areas such as aircraft and submarines. So they're very much trying to harness scientific development for the war effort. From these somewhat tentative beginnings, as the war progressed and the importance of science and engineering to success became clear, confidence grew in the inner circles of the BA, and members began to think about how they, and scientists more generally, might capitalise on this. One of the most striking facts which has been brought home to the country as the war has proceeded, Section E, Engineering, recorded, is that, quote, "It is very largely a struggle of scientists and engineers. No one else really matters. And that the success or failure of a country in warfare is dependent, to a huge extent, on the development of scientific research and the practical application of the results of this research by our great scientific men." With a view to securing their position and continued high levels of government investment after the cessation of hostilities, they argued that, quote, "the economic struggle which will follow the war will still likewise depend to a great degree on scientific development and an application of the scientific method to every department of our national life." You can see the growing confidence in their tone when they're writing. And they argued that the BA as an organisation had succeeded in carving out for itself a unique position to enable it to be at the forefront of this development. During its long period of public work, they wrote, it had been in touch with all classes of the community and had gradually extended its sphere of activity not only throughout the whole of the British Empire, but throughout the whole world. I think that's rather over-optimistic. I'm not sure it ever extended to the whole world, but they were certainly ambitious. At the same time, while the BA identified with the nation and the empire, and with British people of all classes, it enjoyed a powerful independent position above partisan politics. It was not identified in any way with a political party, and moreover, by proving its usefulness and mettle in war, it had succeeded in shedding what it itself referred to as its effete esoteric image from before the war. It was now widely recognised as, quote, treating the problems of the day in a scientific manner and from a practical point of view, and that's from a review of one of its meetings during the war in the Times. These claims are quite something when you compare the self-perceptions of the association at the very beginning of the war. From an organisation that was seen by many to be slipping slowly but surely off the public radar, lacking modern relevance, it could claim with some justification, by the middle part of the war, that Britain's very national welfare and survival as a great power would largely depend on the continued energetic scientific development of Britain and its empire, and the hardy manhood of its scientists. And that was in correspondence with the government in making a case for greater funding for investment in science in 1916 and 17. As well as reconstructing the practice and practitioners of science as manly and modern, the BA worked hard to build a reputation and a set of expertise for judging the masculinity of the entire country. Again, it doesn't use the word masculinity, I should point that out. It uses the word manhood, and that obviously does have slightly different connotations. When consulted by the General Council, the various sectional committees not only discussed ways in which they could work to maximise the natural resources of the empire, they also dwelt on the potential for improving its human resources. Building on a long-standing interest from the latter years of the 19th century in collecting and analysing statistical data on the physical stature and health of the British population, the BA pushed for access to thousands of statistics collected by the War Office and held by the Ministry of National Services on the physical health of British men who entered the armed forces to fight in the First World War. This wasn't simply about carving out a role for the BA as the chief arbiter of the nation's manhood, it was also about working to improve the standard which they found, and that's quite a rhetorically powerful position for science, if you think about it. To this end, various sections, especially and interestingly geography and anthropology, pushed for a large ethnographic study of the various races of man as they appear in the British Isles. Again, I think is an interesting title. Getting their hands on ethnographic studies, photographs and charts assembled by the Germans was a big part of this, as was gaining access to a wide range of ethnographic photographs taken in various locations, above all in Greece, Egypt and the Middle East throughout the early years of the war. This was with a view to establishing a context against which to measure and judge what they termed the physical condition of the manhood of all parts of England. And while that clearly has an age-related meaning in terms of the age of the men that they're looking at, it does also have, I think, quite strongly gendered connotations when you look at it in context. However, while increasingly flirting with the government and embracing the language of nation and empire, we by no means see a wholesale rejection of internationalism during the war years. Indeed, there are strenuous attempts by individuals and groups to maintain and facilitate international scientific collaboration, including with Germany, during the war years. I don't know if you can read what's on that letter. It's just one example of one piece of correspondence I found proposing the British Association as a mediation point or a conduit through which to carry on scientific correspondence with Germany. And the language which is used is very much one of independence, rising above conflict and international disagreement, and that scientists as men have to lead the way, setting example for their fellow men. The project actually didn't come to anything, but it's interesting that it was mooted several times over the course of the war. Burlington House, where the BA had its offices, the suggestion was that might act as the conduit, receiving letters through a Dutch intermediary society from Germany, and then you'd be able to send letters back the same way. This letter, particular one, was written by Hugh Richardson, who was the secretary of Section L, the Educational Science section of the BA, and the distinguished chemist Sir Henry Roscoe. He wanted all scientific correspondence with foreigners to pass through the BA, and this proposal was linked explicitly back to what he described as the original objects of our association, in particular our duty, quote, to promote the intercourse of those who cultivate science in the different parts of the British Empire with one another and with foreign philosophers, to obtain a removal of any disadvantages of a public kind, which he included war under that, of any disadvantages which might impede its progress. It was quite a hard thing, a provocative thing to justify, so they went back to the original object of the association in order to do that. So they make connection with their own history, which, given it's the date I start my project, I found quite interesting. During the war itself, though, the priority remained very firmly on trying to embed and build on the increasing public recognition of the importance of science and the scientist. Key to this was to raise government and public support for science education across the different levels of the British education system. In the middle of the war in 1916, an independent committee was established by E. Ray Lankester, the zoologist and evolutionary biologist, which worked together with the BA to inquire into what it termed the neglect of science in education. Again, it's not a very great picture, but this is their first sort of manifesto to try and win support. And the types of language that they use very much reflect the language that I've encountered in the private correspondence of the leading figures of the BA, which I've mentioned. So it talks about the continued existence of this country as a great power is dependent upon finding men who are not only marked by courage, devotion and self-sacrifice, but who have received a scientific training and think as scientific men. And that should be somewhere on that document. This was a reflection of the enormous importance which develops in science had come to play over the course of the war so far. Traditional patriotic manliness was no longer enough to sustain Britain's great power status and collective masculinity. Scientific knowledge, training and character was what was needed now. Lancaster's report acknowledged the widespread view that the war had begun badly because, quote, our highest ministers of state were thoroughly ignorant of science and scientific virtues. The committee put this down to a persistent prejudice against science throughout the British education system, culminating at university level, where there is still, quote, to some extent an indifferent, not to say contemptuous attitude towards them, the natural and physical sciences. Teaching science on the old literary model preferred at the universities and principally designed to train educated gentlemen simply would not do, according to the committee's report. As a report on science teaching in secondary schools, published independently by the BA in 1917, concluded, schools too were failing to adapt themselves to, quote, the immense social, economic, industrial and scientific changes of recent years. The gravity of the situation is emphasised through the use of an emotive and quite strongly gendered metaphor, literally the subjection and unmanning of science teaching. The stranglehold of outside exams is mastering the schools, the report concluded, making rational teaching and the development of the spirit of inquiry, which is at the heart of the construction of the scientific man, all but impossible. There was no attempt to enthuse students through lessons about the great heroes of past science, and that was one of their biggest complaints. The report said there was a prevalent neglect of the history of discovery among professional teachers of science, and the new situation demanded a different type of character and a new type of man. Commerce and industry are looking to the secondary schools to develop that alertness of mind and dependability in character, the report said, the initiative, resourcefulness and manliness that is expected. The model advocated by a number of witnesses interviewed by the Association's committee were Britain's newly established junior technical schools, whose pupils seemed to encounter little difficulty in finding employment upon graduation, thanks to, quote, an outlook and character which harmonised with the requirements of the industrial world. Although the committee remained chiefly focused on elite education, on the public schools and civil service exams, they did raise the question of the place of science in British education more generally. So to what extent was the BA able to capitalise on the unprecedented opportunities, in its own words, which the war provided for fostering the public recognition of science and the scientist? Well, hopes were certainly high at the end of the war. On the 18th of December 1918, Sir William Abbott Herdman, Professor of Natural History at the University of Liverpool, wrote to the Assistant Secretary of the British Association and long-suffering O.J.R. Howarth, saying we should try and make, and this is one of my favourite phrases that I've ever read in research, I'm bigging it up now, we should try and make a big beat-up of scientific men. I've never heard that phrase before, and I have had 5 or 6 people specialised in handwriting read this, and I'm sure it is beat-up of scientific men, and try and have an unusually important meeting for our first after the war. So in other words, it's going to be a publicity stunt. Understandably, I suppose. The tone adopted at BA meetings held immediately after the war was very triumphalist. At the gathering in 1919, the President's speech referred to the manifold services kindly rendered by the sciences during the war, as though they had a choice not to render them. and this was mirrored in a bolder approach towards the government in urging them to increase the funding of scientific research. In a resolution sent to the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1919, the BA stated their hope that the government now finally recognises that the successful issue of the war has sprung from the efforts of scientific men concentrating on these problems. The conviction that the well-being and security of the nation is dependent on the continuous study of such matters should now be clear. I love the finally recognises, as though they'd been having some trouble. There is a need, they urge, for much closer cooperation between civil and military science in the future, and they were conspicuously apart even in the last decades of the 19th century. And that this recognition was shared on both sides, with the Navy admitting it was now keenly alive to the supreme importance of scientific research. On both sides, too, there were ominous references to being much better prepared for next time, which is quite unsettling to read in 1919. And both acknowledged the need for the universities to be much more closely involved in developing defence technology to win in future. They must bring the full scientific power of the country to bear. The scientists were now acknowledged to be central to the defence of the country, so that really had changed. Another legacy of the war visible in the early interwar period is an even closer identification between the BA and the British Empire. The association came, for example, from 1921 onwards to play an important role in organising this event, the British Empire exhibition, which was finally held in 1924 to 25, but was planned originally to be held in 1921. And just reading some of the publicity material, which was worded by partly by a BA committee set up for the purpose. Every endeavour will be made, the organisers stressed, to illustrate the manifold and powerful relations between science in all its branches and imperial development, very much carrying on that theme from the imperial meetings in the late 19th century. The aims of the exhibition were clear about their desire to extend and to strengthen the closer relations established between science and the empire and between Britain and her colonies during the war. The goal, we are told, was to create an atmosphere favourable to more rapid and complete trade developments, to show the wealth of our imperial assets, and to foster the spirit of unity and brotherhood which animated our peoples during the war. The effect of the war in terms of raising the public and political profile of science and the scientist stretched into and indeed grew in strength during the interwar period. The lesson learned in the hard school of experience during the war, this document continued, that we ought to take advantage far more than we have done of the different soil, climates and peoples which are to be found in our widespread territory. So people are coupled with agricultural resources. Again, is quite interesting. Will be enforced by the exhibition, enforced. Not at all with the idea of furthering any political policy or of separating ourselves from the Comity of Nations, but simply as an understandable measure of self-protection and self-promotion, said without any irony. The natural concomitant of this move to improve the way in which the natural resources of the empire were harnessed for her defence was the development of an educational programme designed to increase the numbers of trained scientists, but also to foster a particular notion of citizenship among children in general, which took as its primary model the ideal scientist. If this were done, quote, little by little the professional workers in science would increase in number and gain in public esteem. So we see a linking of an effectively external event like the British Empire exhibition with the furthering of the place of science within British education. Public opinion would compel, and again I'm quoting from this document, the inclusion of great scientific discoverers and inventors as a matter of course, not only in the Privy Council and in the service of the state, but also in the classroom. This is something that had been bothering them since the beginning of the century, and because of the raised profile of science during the war, they're finally able to put that meaningfully to educational reformers. And the BA actually developed their own programme of educational reform, which is actually adopted. So if we remember the British Association report on science education from 1917, had complained that science teaching was not passionate or independent enough, and did not engage sufficiently with a potentially inspiring history of masculine scientific achievement. It was recommended in 1924 to try a number of schemes in schools to rectify the situation, to try and construct the history of science as that mythical history of masculine reason, which was so well described by Dina Goodman in her work on the Enlightenment. Almost immediately after the end of the war, the British government announced the appointment of a committee to inquire into the position of science in the education system of Great Britain. So this started even well before the British Empire exhibition. It was their first priority after the war, and the government listened. Many members of the BA and of Lancaster's 1916 Neglect of Science Committee gave evidence before this committee, a lot of committees. An interesting aim which the committee lists in its mission statement was to reduce the appeal of ideologies such as communism for working class boys by providing alternative ideals looking to the man of science. The committee expressed the opinion that if science teaching can wed the notion of patriotism to science and industrial questions in the classroom, then the risk of children becoming agitators, which is a quote, will be substantially lowered. In fact, they described it as, quote, their best hope of obviating the dangers which threaten the country in industrial questions. So you can see that the figure of the scientist is taking on quite different connotations in political terms as well. One of its chief strategies for enthusing children, especially working class boys, with this ideal of science citizenship was through the British Association's Educational Pictures Committee, which is one of my favourite. It gets better. It was appointed in 1921, partly in response to the government's positive noises about using education as a means of raising the profile of science. In the committee's first report, I'm talking about the Educational Pictures Committee, we read of their attempts to deliberately choose portraits which inspire this ideal of the hard-working, patriotic science citizen. And science citizen is a term that they used. Professor Rofe, we are told, showed the committee a book containing a portrait of the physician William Harvey, who was regarded as a good example of what a portrait should be if it was to be suggestive and inspiring as well as historical. And they preferred it to be suggestive and inspiring rather than historical. In particular, they wanted to show scientists going about the work of science, we're told. So John Dalton collecting marsh fire gas was one of their favourites. I don't know if you can quite make out what's going on in that picture, but it's going back to the very beginnings of the British Association, and Dalton is someone that I write about in the first chapter of the book, so it's quite nice that an image of him is being used in the final chapter. But basically the idea is that he was a working man of science. He got out, got his hands dirty, and didn't sort of hide in a cloistered university. So this was part of a series called Scientific Worthies, which was recommended in its entirety for use in schools. And one Mr. Brown also made a selection of portraits of scientific men for use in schools, taken from the National Portrait Gallery. And when he presented his report, it was decided that all portraits of scientific men in the National Portrait Gallery should be used in this way. And that was accepted. Likewise, there was a series of paintings depicting the successful British Antarctic expedition of 1910 to 1913, recommended for the same reasons. Its depiction of brave and daring patriotic scientists. That's not me, that is a quote. Harking back deliberately to the Livingstone model of the imperial explorer scientist popular in the late 19th century. Scientists, the committee recommended, should be included along with military figures in a new Makers of History series of images, which they were going to commission, which should include not just Nelson and Wellington, but Livingstone and Darwin as well. Anthropological images depicting different racial types was also commissioned to remind the children of their responsibilities as members of an imperial race. I'm not smiling because I find that a good thing to do. And a series entitled Pictures of War Work in England by Joseph Pennell, which some of you may know, which showed striking images of engineers working on various pieces of war technology and architecture, was also commissioned for use in schools. And you can see here the type of thing that children were going to be exposed to, generally only showing men in positions of scientific activity. And this series in particular was commended as containing excellent examples of the type of inspiring image required. Not sure how they worked that out, but there we are. However, the paradox at the heart of scientists' identity and conception of themselves as men remained. While in some ways they were clearly moving closer to the state and to a notion of patriotic masculinity, internationalism which was, as we have seen, also a profoundly important aspect of the independence characteristic of their identity, remained fundamental too. While they sought to use their raised public profile to benefit from state support and funding, the BA also worked quickly after the end of the war to reassert itself as the chief arbiter of international scientific and educational exchange in Britain, a role which distanced itself from, and rhetorically at least raised it above the state. As well as working with the Universities Bureau of the British Empire, which had been founded shortly before the outbreak of war in 1913, within a few months of the war ending, in early 1919, the BA took the lead in coordinating a new scheme for Anglo-Scandinavian student exchanges, which was also to include some German students. So within a few months of the war ending, they were keen to reassert old ties which had been broken during the war. There was also felt to be a certain heroism, neither exclusively national nor international in character, in assuming responsibility for reconstructing the international scientific community, in claiming to reconstruct civilization, and it was no less than that they were claiming, and by implication defending it. This fitted well with Britain's sense of its imperial responsibilities around the world. So international and imperial, which are often opposed as categories, are often much more closely related, especially in the world of science. So very soon after the end of the war, another committee, a special committee this time, was set up by the BA to work for, and this is in its mission statement, a mitigation of the appalling conditions which prevail in the scientific world in Austria and Germany. And as part of the larger conjoint board of scientific societies, the BA argued that British scientists would in general agree that from more than one point of view there is much to be said for our helping them, Germans and Austrians that is, to restore normal conditions of life in scientific circles. And this was partly with a view to reassuming their leading place within it, the BA, because their most popular partners were the Germans and Austrians and had been for the whole of the 19th century. So they read in detail extracts from the German language press detailing the near impossible conditions under which German and Austrian scientists were struggling. Again, I apologise for the quality of these images, and some of them are very bad translations. I love to the brain workers of the world, which I'm assuming is geistliche Arbeiter or something like this, which is brain workers, is wonderful. But they published quite a few of these appeals, which were handwritten, typed them up and published them, showing the effects of hyperinflation upon purchasing scientific equipment, books and journals, which were far too expensive. Many of the German and Austrian scientists writing referred to themselves as unmanned, as broken, as despondent. Quite a few visitors actually went over to Germany and Austria and looked at the state of their professors and universities and found several professors starving to death for want of money. They'd spent all their money on scientific equipment and trying to maintain journal subscriptions. It sounds sort of ridiculous to us, but it's quite heartbreaking to former colleagues. Many German and Austrian scientists didn't shy away from drawing heavily on the language of scientific internationalism and the language of scientific brotherhood to prick the consciences of their colleagues in other countries. Fritz Haber, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry in Berlin, lamented that if unaided, German scientific institutes would become as, quote, the Venetian palaces which stand empty and present to the visitor an interesting picture of past importance. In former times, the culture of science in Germany was a work of art and the leader of the world, Haber pleaded. But if the continuity of the circle of humanity, which devotes itself to the cause of science, is broken, tens of years will not suffice to make good the destruction thereby wrought. But it's quite lyrical. The translation was also done by members of the British Association and was worked on very hard, and many hours were spent trying to make it the most emotive translation that could be achieved. It will be a loss for all humanity, not just for Germany. Idealism itself will be dead and buried, was the claim. So these pitiful conditions were indeed verified when a young Oxford graduate, Edward Skillings, visited some 11 universities in Germany and Austria in the months after the war ended, noting terrible conditions, including malnutrition and starvation among many professors, in his campaign to provide what he termed intellectual famine relief for Central Europe, which again is an interesting phrase. Skillings described people hungering in mind, soul and body for contact with the intellectual world outside. They seem bewildered by despair, unmanned and broken in spirit, he concluded. The immediate necessity is to inspire hope. In his report, we see how quickly ideals of masculinity endorsed by scientists were shifting. In this context, at least, patriotic military manliness was for wartime. Peacetime demanded something different, derived, according to Skillings, at least, from alternative Christian models of manliness. The question of helping is quite apart from our attitude towards them during the war, he said. Here is one of the hardest tests which practical Christianity and practical men have to face. The desire to help German and Austrian colleagues whose work had been so adversely affected by the war was realised in a number of concrete proposals, not least among which was the foundation and stocking of an Anglo-American library in Germany and Austria, which would go some way towards replacing those journals and books lost or destroyed in the war. It would also act as a symbol of the important role of science and the scientist as the chief architects of post-war peace. Project designers, which included leading figures from the BA, spoke of their hope to see an uplifting of mankind through the encouragement of learning. The library was intended to be symbolic of what its proposals termed the outstretched hand of friendship, which they hoped the Germans and Austrians would grasp in the same spirit in which it was given. The organisers, including the BA, appointed a committee, as we know by now that's what they always do in a crisis, to fix the needs of German science in respect of foreign educational literature, take care of the disposition of books and exchanges in Germany and Austria, and in general to fix the condition of science, which is rather an ambitious goal for a small committee, but which saw itself as being capable of fixing science in the whole of Germany and Austria. The library should, they wrote, serve as a central point for endeavours towards a rebuilding of the international spirit of culture and a rebuilding of the confidence of the intellectual world in Germany, which I think is quite nice. All this was designed to underscore a new peacetime role for the scientist as the architect and arbiter of international peace in the post-war era. The reconciliation among the peoples can only come through the cultivation of mind and spirit, they proclaimed, and it is clear that the great teachers of the world, by the free interchange of ideas, must be the teachers and leaders in such an endeavour. However, it was to be after the war, in the growing internationalist atmosphere of the 20s and 30s, that the development of a rather different brand of scientific masculinity in British schooling was to be seen. So we now go back to look at some of the effects of those schemes that I talked about before. And researching this kind of thing leads you to read all kinds of interesting books, like Citizenship in the School, which first when you look at that title you think, ooh, that's not going to be very, very interesting. But it's all about this new role of science within education, and science as a moral training for citizenship, which wasn't something that I'd really seen before. P.B. Schoen's Citizenship in the School, published in 1923, drew directly upon the recently published findings of the British Association's Committee on Training in Citizenship, which you can see on the right, which was actually chaired by a woman, which is quite significant. She uses the language of manliness and masculinity quite a lot, but doesn't seem to see any disjunction or problem there, which is significant in itself. And she actually died shortly before this was published, so it's also quite significant. And it stressed the importance of masculine examples in citizenship education. So this is shown citing the report. The example set by citizens of the past, he argued, tends to encourage and stimulate public spirit. It may be said that history, and especially biography, will fulfil this aim. Apologise, this is an enormously long quote, but it is relevant. In a measure this is true, but school history at present is so largely concerned with kings, rulers, men of war and of action, that there is a danger of overworking the natural sense of hero worship, or if not of overworking, of misdirecting it. There is no doubt that men of valour and prowess in battle have their place, and make a more ready appeal to boys than leaders of thought or of science. This is only to be expected, but if a civic bias is to be given to the teaching and lessons of history in peacetime, then we need to choose models which show the debt that nations owe to men of science and to leaders in peace. Then this helpful hero worship can be directed. Peace hath her victories, Eton will be proud of Lord Roberts VC, and East Ham School will be proud of Jack Cornwall VC, as long as boys are boys, but teachers must correct the balance, for men like Newton, Kelvin and Pasteur, who all occurred in my little cute Men of Science at the opening slide, but teachers must correct the balance, for men like Newton, Kelvin and Pasteur must not lose their due meed of reward. The war has altered our conception of patriotism and of manliness, and at last we see that the true criterion of love of country is applied social service, giving the best to the community in time of peace no less than in war. Thus he continued, a science master who fails to give his pupils some account of the life and work of the great scientists whose work may be under study in his lecture theatre or laboratory is not making the most of his subject, or of his opportunities for imparting knowledge and manliness which is of definite value as a preparation for citizenship. Some knowledge of Boyle, Newton, Ohm, Kelvin as men, rather than mere names, must make the subject more interesting, quite apart from any value such knowledge may have in helping a pupil to form a habit of mind which disposes him to judge men's worth in terms of their services to mankind. And to end his book, he recounted the example of a science master at West Square Central School in Southwark, who has made cards, such as these, which are admirably illustrated and designed. Each one shows a picture of a famous scientist, his nationality, birthplace, dates and period, his school and workplace, and the discoveries and work for which he was famous, and the BA sponsored the creation of these cards and their distribution among every school in the country. When the work of any of these men of science is under study, or if it is the anniversary or centenary of any particular scientist, I'm quoting Schoen again, then his picture and record are exhibited in the calendar or roll of honour, and a short talk by one of the pupils is held about him and his work. The pupils themselves often volunteer to execute extra cards in their spare time. To imagine that happening today, it may do in some schools, and the framed cards form perhaps the most treasured and certainly not the least valuable exhibit in the school's laboratory. So I've taken it sort of all the way up to almost the 1930s, which perhaps a bit longer than I'd hoped to, but I think it does show how these things played out in the longer term. So I'll now conclude, because I'm possibly, yes, almost out of time. So in this talk today, I've tried to capture something of the complex relationship between science and the changing construction of British masculinity against the background of World War I and the early interwar years. And really to trace some of these strands, I have gone really quite deeply into the interwar period. As we've seen, Science of Britain examined here through the rich and I think quite underutilised archives of the British Association, enjoyed something of a paradoxical relationship with discourses of masculinity. On the one hand, making much of the opportunity presented by the war, and that was the dominant language used in the first 2 or 3 years, science tried to bind itself to narratives of national and imperial heroism. Yet on the other, it still clung to an ideal and language of internationalism inherited from its 19th century origins, and which caused it and its practitioners on occasion to be seriously suspected of disloyalty and unmanly cowardice. And yet it was this spirit of internationalism which proved an important model for an alternative form of manly citizenship, which we have seen distributed through schools in peacetime. And that's where I'd like to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I'm going to throw the floor open to questions at this point.
Thank you, that was really, really interesting. For my question, I just want to draw attention to 2 things that you mentioned. The first is this idea of the war as an exceptional opportunity for proving manhood in a time of crisis. That was talked about in 1916. And then the fact that the success in warfare, according to the BA, depended on outcomes of scientific research carried out by our great scientific men. In terms of language, you talk about discovering the language of nation and empire, and make that really clear, and obviously internationalism, heroism.
Yep.
And then towards the end, I think specifically with regards to the interwar period, you talk explicitly about the language of courage, devotion, self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, on the kind of language level, whether you come across anything that made sort of explicit or implicit comparisons between the VA and scientists more generally and combatants. you know, along the lines of heroism, self-sacrifice, things like that. I just wondered if you come across any of that.
The most obvious place is actually when the scientists themselves discuss their students who are fighting, who are combatants, and carry out science while they're at the front, and send correspondence back when it makes it back. And they talk about setting up a university or a research lab actually in the field. And they send botanical specimens back and forth. And they talk about them being the sort of scientific army. And there's quite an interesting discourse. It tends to be based at particular universities rather than at the BA. So people who are quite prominent in the BA, several professors at Glasgow, for instance, have an awful lot of students fighting in various locations. And they say, you know, this is the model that we should be emulating. There is still a sort of perception that because they're very much based at the home front and they're not in the field actually fighting, that they could be accused of cowardice. And several newspapers did say that they were under enormous pressure to prove themselves, so they would then refer to their students fighting on the front who've given up a promising scientific career. Many of them volunteered, you know, at the beginning of the war, and left, you know, a very lucrative fellowship or whatever it might have been. So they do play on that very much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's really fascinating. What I was wondering about was when you speak about after the war, the BAs sort of say this is showed that science is integral to warfare, and we've proven that. But now we can use science in peacetime in things like welfare and health, I think you mentioned. I just wondered if that was related at all to things like rehabilitation of soldiers or working with the medical sphere or Ministry of Pensions or anything like that.
I think certainly implicitly it has to be, because if you look at the experience both during the war and afterwards of several of the leading members of the BA who do put together these schemes for schools and who help to draft the texts which end up in these types of books, they are involved in the rehabilitation of soldiers. I can only perhaps think of 2 or 3 explicit cases, but I think it must have been a wider experience. They're certainly aware of the role of science as a caring, sort of healing profession, as much as something actively defending the nation in conflict. Particularly the physiology section of the British Association, which there's no medical section as such, which is often surprising to people because you would think that was, you know, but there is a physiology section which is quite active in rehabilitative medicine after the war.
Go ahead, Pastor Williamson.
Last question.
Yes.
That was really fascinating. I mean, I've been studying the BAAS for most of my career, and it's then there's moments where things don't quite go as it was.
Yeah.
Right, so, I mean, the first one was Charles Dickens' satire of it as the month of the
That's right, yeah.
Everything.
Yeah, which is wonderful. Isn't it?
And you know, but when you think about the universities start upstate, so yes, but when you have science and important universities, you can't complain anymore. There's no science.
That's right.
Science like ours.
After the 1850s, it's all downhill.
It's all done, so I think they're going to try and find something they can do. And one of the things that I don't know what you thought about was the way that the ideals of masculinity get reasserted is when they start to have to look to the state in really quite awkward ways. So having spent 80 years really actually looking to voluntarism.
That's right, yeah.
Self-reliance. Looking to the state makes them very uneasy. And that seems to be when they start really being very assertive about manly ideals. Which, obviously the contrast being Will Scott, Antarctic.
Yes.
He didn't make it, but
but he dies trying.
He dies heroically actually under their resources and not being paid for by the state so much. And that seems to be the ghost of the feast of the
Yes, I agree. I think, if you go back, you know, to the sort of 1860s, 1870s, when this discourse of empire first begins to sort of infiltrate the British Association, private correspondence, but also their minutes of official committee meetings and so on. And you look at some of the members of the X Club who are really active in the BA at that time, particularly Huxley and Tyndall and people like this, who are fiercely committed to the independence of science and really resent all of this sort of imperial language and call it, Tyndall calls it a load of nonsense. and dependence on the state. But at the same time, they acknowledge the practical necessity almost of going to the state for help with certain things and lobbying, and actually set up a committee to lobby government. They had one in the, I believe in the 30s or 40s when Sabine was active in trying to get money for explorations and magnetic, oh gosh, what, I can't think of the, yes, that's right, around the world, and sort of goes back to that and says we need one of these committees again, and they do it almost against their better judgment. So it is very much a controversial, and it's all discussed in the language of the independence of the scientist and the sort of the integrity of the scientist. So there is a sense in which their sort of masculine identity is being compromised by this flirting with the state.
Within that, there's lots of different kinds of British.
Yeah.
Perry's Irish, Irish.
That's right.
Schuster is actually German.
Yes,
I mean, how much does that create against attention? I'm trying to override those differences in this message.
Well, I think one of the reasons for the shift to the sort of the overseas meetings and the imperial discourse which goes with that is very much about trying to sublimate differences which are problematic on an individual and sort of personal level. I mean, Tyndall's made fun of for his Irish accent and appearance and all the rest of it, and there are earlier examples you could cite. And Schuster also has some anti-Semitism directed at him before his election, well before, as do other German Jewish members who are quite prominent. So I think they do find in imperialism, as many other bodies did, a sort of unifying rhetoric, particularly if you think about the problems with the anti-vivisection criticism and other critiques of the BA in the 1860s and early 70s. I don't think it's a coincidence that they start looking for a new direction. And I think that's been argued before by Roy McLeod and others. That's not a new argument.
Thank you. I was really fascinated to hear about the speed with which they set about establishing the international community of science after the war. That was really new to me. And I was particularly interested in the language they used about the uplifting campaign to scientific endeavour. And I wondered how they dealt with, particularly you mentioned Fritz Haber, who invented poison gas.
That's right, yes.
How they dealt with this
I didn't mention that.
Immorality. I mean, did they just not mention that at all, or was it something that was dealt with in ways that rationalised it? Because it strikes me that the idea of manliness and then these weapons that kept categorised at times as being particularly sneaky and devious and evil, the poison gas and the bombardment of civilians, babies, particularly, and civilian targets. I wondered how they managed to square that at the end of the war, and how Fritz Haber could be so quickly rehabilitated that he was making this impression of his.
I mean, Fritz Haber's almost being critical of, I mean, he's almost saying you're not doing enough. You know, this is your fault. I mean, if you actually read the original German, the tone is almost blaming, you know, the British Association and others for not reacting even more quickly. You know, this beautiful, beautiful jewel which is German science will be destroyed if you don't act, as though, you know, it was their fault that it had happened in the first place. That's a peculiar characteristic of Fritz Haber in the way that he writes, that it's not necessarily reflective of some of the other appeals which are much more humble. It was very difficult for them to justify, to square it. I mean, I think almost within a week of the end of the war, there was already discussion within the BA committees, which don't meet actually outside of the annual meeting, but did have extraordinary meetings after the war, which is interesting. They do that very rarely, and discussed how they might go about building the international community of science, or rebuilding it, within a week of the war ending. I mean, but it's not. There was never a caesura. It never stopped completely. I tried to show just a few instances of how it really continued throughout the war. So it was never off the table. There were members of those committees that said, this isn't the time, we have to wait, we can't just pretend this never happened. But the overriding sentiment is that scientists are not responsible for the decisions of governments, even when so many German professors publicly went further than they ever had to articulate not just their support but their impassioned support for the Germans. And at the time that received an extremely bitter response among former colleagues in England. Some people terminated lifelong friendships over it and never re-established them. Not everybody in the BA was okay with this. This is the official line. This is the organisation's rhetoric. If you look at correspondence between people, that they couldn't get people to sit on this committee. They found it very difficult to recruit people that they wanted of prominent enough status to sit on it. Several people refused because they'd had brothers or sons killed, or they had had a 40-year collaboration with a German professor who was now starving and almost destitute, but had signed this letter of the German professors, or manifesto, and that was it for them. So there's a story behind they wanted very much to appear to be, they wanted to get in there first, to be the ones to lead the charge, if you like. And I think they were also genuinely moved by the predicament of certain professors who they didn't really know what conditions they were living in until Skillings went out there and took photographs and took first-hand testimony and came back with it and said they're not only sorry and sort of pining away, they have no equipment, no research has been done, projects which were really promising have fallen away, and that we as the scientific community stand to lose out if we let this, if we don't act now and stop it now. It will, the loss to humanity would be. It was trying to remember that the German scientists had done so many more, I don't want to say positive because that's too easy a phrase. It wasn't always about destruction. Before the war, they were their most important partner in nearly all the most important projects the BA brought to fruition in the 19th century was done with German support and help. At one point, a third of their membership were German, or had some sort of German links. You can't break that sort of connection overnight, and then not expect people to want to rebuild it. So there are a lot of conflicting emotions. It wasn't as easy as I made it sound. That was the way they wanted it to appear, and they weren't afraid of it appearing like that. But underneath the surface, it was much more difficult.
I have a quick question about these top trumps of male scientists that you ended with. Are they 20s or 30s?
20s.
20s. Because I wondered, because they're obviously then, the ingredients of this new scientist as civic hero
Yes.
that will be competition and
Yeah.
inspire and pass
Yeah.
on. Who is chosen and who's excluded? And so, are there German Jewish scientists included? Are there any women? Can you see in the particular men they selected for this
Yep.
what they were looking for as an individual hero?
It's certainly more open than it was before the war. That certainly has happened, and that reflects the going back to an internationalist stance, and it reflects, I think, hopefully learning some of the lessons of the exclusions, which perhaps I mentioned sort of looking at the races of man, but that sort of language is still there. That was also in only 2 or 3 years previously that they wanted school children to learn about their responsibilities as an imperial race. So however open it appears, you have to balance it with there's still quite a heavy imperialist racial rhetoric in the background as well. Some women were chosen, yes. They were usually scientific wives, and they weren't treated in quite the same way. They didn't have their own poster or small card, but they would be mentioned on male scientists' cards as being of interest in their own right. Now, I know that sounds quite pathetic from our point of view, but I've gone through reading these individual cards, and on quite a number of them, wives and daughters are mentioned as being unusually talented, which again is very condescending. There are a couple of instances of women in their own right. Mary Somerville is one of them, who is a figure from the very early history of the BA, and although her work was read out and at the Royal Society, she never appeared in person. and interestingly, there's no picture on her card. I'm not quite sure why, because there are plenty of images of Mary Somerville. I'm not sure why that was. But I think out of 100 scientists, I think only 2 were women. But that to some extent reflected the fact that women were not, given their due,
Was there a range of nationalities?
Yes, there was. Although probably about 3/4 were British, and there definitely was a nationalist and imperialist sort of tone to it. There were a significant number of German scientists. That's the second largest group, and Austrians, and then also French, American, the normal usual suspects. But yes, it was more open than anything the 19th century produced, which was exclusively British. There were some of these cards in the 1890s, which were self-produced by students and pupils, and were exclusively British, but that also reflected the knowledge that they would have had access to. This was an official programme, so a little bit different.
Thank you. I was just wondering, you talked about at the start how in the media scientists have been portrayed as almost kind of foppish.
Yes.
How that kind of changed over the war, whether there was a pivotal changing point or whether it was more gradual?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it was a gradual change. I think it's probably 1916 is the year when it changes most dramatically. I can't link that to a particular event. I can link it to particular sort of publications. There seems to be, it's the point at which the Navy admits that scientific research has become critical. It's that word critical, which is discussed very much within the BA as a real achievement, because they've been making sort of overtures to the armed forces for several years before the war and have really had no impact whatsoever. There was very little contact, surprisingly little contact, between civic and military science in the years up to 1914. It's a relationship they developed literally spontaneously out of the moment. They don't even know who to talk to in the British Association. I mean, sort of they get in touch and they write to even the assistant secretary, but they write to his, personal assistant, and they just don't know who to go to at all. And I think you also see it in the tone and the level of confidence with which they express themselves, and that really changes about the midpoint of the war. Not quite sure why. I need to do some more work on that, because I wonder if there was a particular turning point or a particular event which demonstrated the usefulness of science, which was then sort of jumped on as this shows what we knew all along. So any ideas, let me know.
This isn't really my area, so I might be completely off here. But in regards to that, I was wondering, could you sort of say that traditional ideas about masculinity are kind of changed, and then you see science as being thought of as a masculine thing. And I was wondering if you could link it to, you probably know much more about this, but the shell shock and masculinity being challenged by that, and then if they can see it masculinity as tied into something more intellectual, is that a way for sort of save themselves? I don't know. It's just amazing.
I'm not going to say a word about shell shock really. With Jessica in the room. I think there is something in that, yes, that particularly when you see how easily men can be destroyed and damaged and hurt, and that this rhetoric of masculinity is basically, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not real, it's just a sheen, if you like, and that underneath it's much harder to rehabilitate someone from that damaging experience, and actually takes much more courage and dedication and skill than to actually go and blow someone up. And there's discussions about and comparisons between the compassion and the courage of doctors in particular within the British Association literature compared to the sort of martial courage of men going off to war. And that also speaks to the comparison of the scientists with the combatants. And they do draw on that. to make a case for scientists being not so much similar to the active martial kind of valor of the combatants, but actually as having something more long-lasting and more valuable. And it is intellectual. Yes, it is opposed to, this is culture, this is civilization, this is healing, whereas war is about destruction, and that does start before the war's end. Once they've capitalized on their practical and technological success in actually helping to win the war, they do then reflect again on what it is they're meant to do as scientists, and then they start talking almost as doctors about healing not just individual soldiers but healing mankind, and you have that uplift language, and that idea that they're going to be the reconstructors of civilization, which is a bit of an awkward phrase, which is one that comes through quite a lot. Don't know if that answers your question. It probably doesn't. It's just my general impressions rather than anything concrete.
Jump in with another potential suggestion. The turning point, of course, is 1916, is the introduction of conscription.
Yes, that's true.
And the idea of compulsion, which also raises the issue of what becomes a protected field of work for men, and what is appropriately masculine to be in these protected areas. And Mauro Guarini's written a little bit about men who are working in scientific careers who struggle with their sense of identity. I did wonder whether it might be worth comparing some of the discussions with discussions in the BMA, the British Medical Association, about the recruitment of medical officers. Where are they more important in terms of their healing? Public officers of health become the issue of civil medicine becomes a real
yes, I can imagine
debate, which Ian Whitehead's written a bit about. So I think there are a number of interrelated discourses around masculinity that come to a peak in 1916.
Yeah, it's interesting that in both areas it seems to be then that that does change. Yeah, no, that's a
and
very good
I
point.
think what I find fascinating is this idea of a professional masculine identity having particular meanings for masculinity, which I think the war throws into question about what sort of professions does a nation value.
Exactly, and that's spoken to in that, if I can even find it, I can't remember, I think it was in that very long quote that I read out about the war has changed our conceptions, I mean, explicitly, not just of what patriotism is, but also about what we value in our professions, and that you know, it might be great to have 25 VCs in your school, but we have to show, you know, that the caring professions and that scientists are valued in terms of applied social, that patriotism is applied social service. I'm sure that must fit in with the medical discourse as well.
And what professions are appropriately manly.
Yes.
That distinction
Exactly.
between masculinity and manliness that you identify.
Exactly. Yeah. No, definitely. That's given me a lot to think about. Yes. Thank you.
Did they try and recruit other scientific societies to their causes to sort of promote science in their science education programmes to try and get everyone else on board too? Or is it, this is our project, the BA is what I think is the expression, leading the charge,
Yes.
and therefore way better than everybody else? If you
Yeah, I hadn't thought about these sort of connotations of that. They do. I mean, they work with Ero Lancaster's independent committee, for one example. They tend to be quite selective in who they work with, because they often see themselves as speaking for science collectively, and there are a few bodies that do that. In fact, there are probably no other bodies that do that in quite that way. Also, the members of the BA are also members of individual scientific societies, and they tend to bring them in with them. They'll often be the president of a section in the BA, may well be high up in the organisation of individual scientific societies related to a particular discipline or cause. And quite often there is extensive correspondence between different societies, both before, during and after the war, and there's a whole box of it in the archives which I've gone through. and in general they take them with them. They don't really have to say this is ours. They have that lead in place already. It's simply that they were, I suppose, scientific societies as a whole were seen as sort of rather lacking in substance and relevance by, say, the 1910s. Wasn't quite sure what the significance of them anymore was, as science was increasingly embedded within education.
How are scientists minded with the BA being there, I suppose, for people who like talking about science?
I think certainly yes, in some circumstances, as they were increasingly sort of criticised for not being as relevant as they had been 2 generations or 3 generations before. There was quite a lot of talk about also sort of international societies having much more clout, if you like, than the British Association, which, for all its imperial meetings and its overseas meetings, was still a national association. This is the period where you see the foundation of international societies for biology, for chemistry, for physics, having their first meetings, and sometimes within certain quarters in the BA they do see those as competing for the same type of attention and support. It's not a wholly easy relationship, particularly when you see permanent offices established in Geneva and other places. They don't necessarily like the way things are going. So that's another reason why they see the war as an opportunity to sort of prove themselves and take back that ground which they feel in some ways they've lost to perhaps more active societies on an international stage.
You told us about the educational programs and also about the public lectures that they gave in terms of showcase scientific discoveries and research. And I was wondering, to what extent did they make use of the press to do that? Because I realised when you were talking, that actually came across quite a few of the stuff that they were doing, and I don't know, like articles about Darwin and hormones and stuff in the local press, which I did not expect. I was wondering how common that was.
It was very, very common. They had a press officer, particularly for the Educational Pictures Committee, whose sole job it was to promote these chosen programs, visual programs of pictures which they chose. They used national media above all. They did use local media too. But they had feature articles in the Times and several. They had a lot of money, and they had an enormous publicity budget, which is much bigger than anything I saw before the war. And it's all budgeted, which is useful because it gives you an indication of how important they see different educational programs which they set out. I think they even when the BBC begins as well, they very much jump on that bandwagon as well, and they start within the sort of mid-30s of trying to produce scientific TV programs for young audiences. That starts very early on, and then of course is abandoned in the Second World War, but then is resumed in the late 40s quite quickly, when they realise that they do have a challenge from other scientific bodies, and they're losing their appeal for young people, which bothers them a lot in 48, 49. We're all questioned out.
We seem to have a habit of just about everybody asking questions.
No, it's lovely. It's lovely to have so many questions.
Thank you so much, Heather. If we could thank our speaker one last time. And next semester we will hopefully be looking at resistance to war in various forms. Do you want to give a talk for the conference?